Hi, everyone. My name's Stephanie, and I use she, her pronouns. Just to preface, I was sick 2 weeks ago, so I have a cough that just won't quit. So apologies for that in advance. But yeah, so Lubaba and I are going to take turns kind of going back and forth between, instead of just doing 15 minutes and 15 minutes, we're just going to have more of a conversation style approach. Hopefully that keeps it entertaining in some sense. So yeah, just get right into it. So Claudia Jones, she was an influential writer and a lead theoretician in the Communist Party of the USA in the 1930s and 50s to the 50s. She was an organizer, advocate, and journalist that faced severe repression due to her communist organizing in the United States. Claudia Jones developed the superexploitation theory that addressed the triple oppression that black women workers were facing in the USA, and is the basis for the understanding of modern-day intersectionality. Claudia developed these theories through her Marxist-Leninist lens and was a committed communist until the end of her life. Claudia Jones's legacy and contributions to communist thought and theory have been erased from our consciousness, and her radical legacy and work needs to be rediscovered for modern socialists. So going into her early life, Claudia Jones was born in Port of Spain, Trinidad in 1915, when it was still a colony of Great Britain. Trinidad was experiencing heavy economic disparity at this time, and Claudia's family decided to move to New York in 1924, when Claudia was just 9 years old, and she moved there with her 2 parents and her 4 sisters. Her father worked many jobs, but he worked as a journalist in Harlem, and her mother was a garment factory worker. Her experiences as a black migrant in Jim Crow USA and the poverty that her family experienced defined her activism early on. In high school, she was active in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP, and wrote for the paper that her father worked at. Sadly, her mother died at the age of 39 to spinal meningitis while she was at work on the factory floor. And this experience really would later to support her understandings of the triple oppression of black women workers. So shortly after this, Claudia was hospitalized because she was for close to a year because she was diagnosed with tuberculosis. And this would lead to lifelong struggles with her health. Claudia graduated high school in 1935 and began working also in factories, laundries, and as a writer. She wrote her own column, known as Claudia's Comments, and also became the editor of a youth paper. It was around this time, so right after she graduated, that she became active in the Scottsboro Boys organizing, which Lubaba will talk about a little bit later. And it would eventually lead her to join the Communist Party of the USA. Here, she was assigned to the youth movement and became the associate editor of the Weekly Review, and she was the secretary of the executive committee of the Young Communist League in Harlem in 1938.
Thanks, Stephanie. Hi, folks. I'm Lubaba Gemma, as my comrades Loretta and Steph mentioned. I use she and they pronouns. And I'm very excited to be doing this talk with Stephanie today. If you didn't know, we are both Libras, and it is our birthday weekend. So it was really fun to put together this talk with Stephanie, to say the least. To continue, when Claudia Jones first emerged in politics, or just as an activist, she primarily organized within the Communist Party in the 1930s. And at the time, she was the only black woman to ever be elected to the Central Committee. And to this day, she also remains the only black woman to ever serve on that committee. Claudia Jones was involved in a lot of contested politics or political disputes in their early phases. And we know that a lot of her activism and a lot of her work was done ahead of the civil rights movement. But a lot of her advocacy, even for other later activists, such as Nelson Mandela, persisted even in her lifetime. towards the end of her lifetime in the 1950s and just before the civil rights movement. She was a vocal supporter of releasing Nelson Mandela. And when it came to the Scottsboro Boys, these were a group of 9 young black men that were wrongly accused of assaulting a white woman. And at a time where, you know, the U.S.'s politics is often based on a dichotomy, Democratic, Republican, and when it came to the advocacy of the Democrats that had power, they wouldn't go near the speaking out about the Scottsboro Boy trials, you know, and Claudia Jones was integral, and also the NAACP wasn't interested, didn't want to touch the Scottsboro Boys case either. And at a time where all of these other greater or just more powerful bodies weren't speaking out about this issue, Claudia Jones was really integral in making sure that the Communist Party did speak out in support of the Scottsboro Boys. And as she grew, and so later on, the NAACP also took this on because of her advocacy. And mind you, again, this is probably the 1940s when this was happening. And so as she grew in her leadership abilities, she served as the secretary of the Communist Party's, of the USA's Women's Commission as well. And this is where she began to travel extensively across the USA, especially to recruit more women into the party and really include as many people, as many women as possible, especially as many racialized women as possible, and really help to mobilize the masses. Around this time, she became a very important writer. She wrote expertly on theorizing oppression, and she primarily focused on integrating race and gender issues into Marxist frameworks, advocating for black women's rights throughout through the Communist Party of the USA. Some of her notable works include An End to the Neglect of the Problems of Negro Women from 1949, and in this she explores and documents black women's socioeconomic struggles until that time. And as Steph mentioned, she also coined superexploitation theory, expanding on Marxist theories to include black women's unique position as superexploited workers in society. And so this brings me to the idea of black Bolsheviks and the significance of black Bolsheviks in our organizing. And how integral and how invaluable the work of our black comrades are in really pushing forward racial justice in our working class advocacy. We know that black history has often been hidden. It has been erased, written over, buried, or withheld. And black Bolsheviks, particularly those in the USA, were arguably invaluable in the movement and in creating the people power that not only the Communist Party, but that the overall labor movement in America had mobilized, right? The introduction of racial justice is not just a priority, but as an integral part of leftist and labor organizing was obviously not welcome until it was, right? And just like any other exception to the rules in leftist spaces, and when I say exception, I think of Palestine, I think of disability justice, I think of, you know, and perhaps more issues across the horizon. I think of all of these issues in leftist spaces especially that are still considered the exception until they aren't, right? And I think Claudia's work really speaks to that piece. Where racial justice just wasn't deemed essential and integral to white working class issues either until it was, right? And this is a conversation we're obviously still having, but yeah, to come back to Claudia Jones's work, she was really integral in making a lot of these ideas grow in the USA, especially at a time where so many people still remained enslaved, right? And so, and I want to also, and so I want to address the fact also that at a time where black bodies were incredibly limited in their powers, Claudia went so far as to even advocate for women who were kicked out of their homes. She advocated for women who were kicked out and had no other support against their landlords, and was able to secure a group of women in the southern United States their homes back. And I think that also goes to show the amount of work and organizing and advocacy that we do, not only on like a larger level or on like a theoretical level, but at the day-to-day and what that actually looks like in our material conditions. And so, you know, as all of this is happening during a very contested period, especially when the world, as in when geopolitical powers are very also sort of positioned in a dichotomy. We're looking at, you know, a post-World War II era. We're looking at a time where, you know, the greatest threat to Western imperialism is the rise of communism, right? And so, of course, Jones was no exception to the myriad of communists and activists that were targeted by the state. And so during the Scottsboro Boyd trial, she became involved in this kind of organizing at a much higher level, where she became much more widely visible as well. And so as she continued on her work, the state clearly realized, like, oh, this could be a threat to our colonial system. And in the 50s, she was imprisoned and faced trial for her communist affiliations. After International Women's Day that year, she delivered a beautiful speech, which I highly encourage you all to go and check out after this talk. She gave a speech, and after that speech, she was imprisoned and sentenced to a year and 1 week in prison. She served about 10 months of her sentence at Alderson, West Virginia, before she was released due to health concerns. As someone who was born in Trinidad, she didn't really have, her statehood belonged to Britain because Trinidad was still a colony at the time. And as the US started targeting her more and more and recognized just how much her organizing efforts would be a threat to their systems and structures, Jones was eventually deported, and in doing so, they sent her to Britain, cutting short her activism in the States at the time. However, you know, by the time she was deported, she'd probably been imprisoned about 3 times, and she still persisted. In Britain, she didn't stop her organizing. In 1958, she founded the West Indian Gazette, which was an anti-racist newspaper campaigning for social equality. And so what she was really aiming to do was take her lessons that she had really worked through in the US, and as soon as she was in Britain, she hit the ground running and started corralling the diaspora in order to create this more internationalist movement, right? And the West Indian Gazette really sought to unite the diaspora specifically and foster that dialogue to create these larger freedom movements.
So yeah, I'm just going to read a quote from Claudia Jones about her deportation, because she was deported. The FBI file says that she was an enemy of the state because of her communist beliefs, because they made it illegal to be a communist at that time. So this was her quote. So Claudia says, "I was the victim of the McCarthyite hysteria against independent political ideas in the USA, a hysteria which penalizes anyone who holds ideas contrary to the official pro-war, pre-reactionary, pro-fascist line of the white ruling class of that country. I was deported from the USA because as a black woman communist of West Indian descent, I was a thorn in their side in my opposition to Jim Crow racist discrimination against 16 million black Americans in the United States. I was deported for my work for redress of these grievances, for the unity of black and white workers, for women's rights, and my general political activity urging the American people to help by their struggles to change the present foreign and domestic policy of the United States. I was deported and refused an opportunity to complete my American citizenship because I fought for peace against a huge arms and budget, which should be directed to improving the social needs of people, which is very true today. I was deported because I urged the prosecution of lynchers rather than the prosecution of communists and other democratic Americans who opposed the lynchers and big financiers and warmongers, the real advocates of force and violence in the USA.
And so to come back to the topic of our workshop today, I want to touch on intersectionality for a bit and how our communist and socialist organizing really, and our history, has sort of shaped that, and what that actually looks like leading up to, when a term is much more widespread or common language. And so many of us in this room probably know what intersectionality is, or otherwise understand the application of it. And in today's workshop, we outlined the life of Claudia Jones to really understand the contributions of that's not my notes, of Black Bolsheviks and their contributions to our work. Okay, wow, my notes are all out of order. Thank you for bearing with us, guys. No, maybe I changed this is your page. Oop. Sorry, give me one moment to reorder my pages. Okay, you're actually still right. Thank you for bearing with me. Wonderful. So most of us in the room probably know what intersectionality is. A lot of the work that goes into creating messaging and creating a campaign to rally people behind, something like Ceasefire Now, it takes strategic messaging, right? And in order for us to come to a conclusion as to what this title should be for whatever cause, there's a lot of people that put in the work beforehand and do the hard work of building that capacity in order for these things to become more widespread knowledge, right? And so many of us know intersectionality as Kimberly Crenshaw had coined it in 1989. Kimberly Crenshaw was a civil rights activist and a leading scholar of critical race theory, and she wrote this essay in 1989, coining the term intersectionality and recognizing how the different levels of oppression in our lives do not exist in silos, but rather work in tandem with each other in a non-hierarchical way in order to impact our lives and our experience of social issues. And so something that I have lost my notes. Oh, I lied. And so something that is important to remember here is that while Crenshaw's contributions to leftist politics was incredibly integral and was incredibly important, today we're fleshing out the events and contributions of those up until this moment to show how the on-the-ground organizing can eventually lead to these greater movements that we know today and that are more commonly widespread. And so as a side note, I also want to recognize that me and Stephanie are not Black, and so we don't claim to be experts on the Black experience. But as comrades, we share the responsibility to do this collective labor together, and that means being an expert in, or trying to become an expert in the ways we show and express our solidarity as well, and how we commit to doing that work and shaping our own collective liberation. And so intersectionality, again, to come back, describes how different forms of oppression intersect and can't be ranked hierarchically. And as individuals, we can't neglect the feature of oppression in these features of oppression in our politics if we want to be truly effective in building our leftist movements. And so when it comes to our socialist understanding of intersectionality, we can recognize in most spaces that racism, sexism, classism, ableism, all of these ideas work in tandem and also alone to impact our social experiences. But in order to fight capitalism, we cannot exclude the fight against racism, just like our comrades mentioned last night at our opening panel, how housing is a labor issue, right? How Palestine is a labor issue, how our justice and our liberation is intertwined with one another. And so a handful of comrades within Spring Magazine have written a few pieces for the magazine on Claudia Jones. And so some of the work done by other wonderful authors includes author Ashley Borer, who wrote a book called Marxism and Intersectionality. And this book really analyzes how we can reconcile Marxist and intersectional theories, arguing that both frameworks are deeply rooted in activism and essential for understanding contemporary social issues, and how these neoliberal sort of takes on, or neoliberal co-opting of intersectionality has sort of gotten, how we've sort of gotten to that today, and how we can reconcile that relationship. And Stephanie is going to talk a little bit more about that later. To speak to the historical context, both Marxism and early intersectional thought emerged in the mid-19th century, with Marx and Engels linking capitalism to various forms of oppression, including racism and sexism. In terms of what was going on in the Communist Party in the US in the 1930s, the CP did connect Marxist theory with the struggles of Black women advocating for their rights within labor movements. And so with Jones's leadership, they contributed a lot of ideas that argued that the liberation of Black women is essential for broader women's struggles and rights, and that collective class struggle. And again, emphasizing their triple exploitation as workers, as women, as Black individuals, to the super exploitation theory, as mentioned. Now, a really important group of people that were important in a lot of this advocacy that Claudia Jones was also doing. You know, she wasn't the only one, right? But the Combahee River Collective was also an integral part of a lot of the more intersectional organizing that was being done at the ground level during this period. And this group essentially critiqued mainstream Marxism for its failure to address the specific economic realities facing Black women specifically, and really focused on advocating for a more inclusive analysis in like our broader working class movements. And so when it comes to coalition building, both intersectionality and Marxism emphasize coalition building among various oppressed groups to strengthen resilience against systemic injustices. A point of fragmentation that has come up within Marxist communities is that some Marxists argue that intersectional theory can lead to fragmentation in groups, and that it shouldn't be a priority that is intertwined. However, the author Borer counters that it actually fosters coalition work, and again speaks to some of the speakers that we heard last night and some of the sentiments that they shared about how our liberation and justice is intertwined. And so as the rise of intersectionality in academia became more widespread, social movements began to decline in the 1970s and 80s. And around then, intersectionality transitioned into more academic discourse, but was often neglected class issues, and eventually led to that sort of separation of intersectionality theory from Marxist theory in popular conversation. But however, Borer, the author, emphasizes that solidarity is meant to be a strategy, that recognizing diverse oppressions can strengthen anti-capitalist organizing by fostering solidarity among different marginalized groups. And so I do want to also reaffirm the anti-capitalist piece here, that capitalism is a central factor in shaping race, gender, and sexuality expression. And so our advocacy necessitates an anti-capitalist approach in order to address these issues effectively, right? If we cannot address racism without addressing capitalism. We cannot address gender discrimination without addressing capitalism, et cetera. And in the future, there's Ashley Borer speaks to the fact that there is potential for renewed dialogue between Marxist and intersectional traditions in order to create more inclusive movements against systemic oppression. And this is a great place to be in order to really make that happen and look within ourselves and think about how that can be shaped even more thoughtfully in our own communities. And so to come to intersectionality from Claudia's understanding and sort of her impact on our knowledge and our experiences of intersectionality in our day-to-day lives, I wanted to reiterate that my point that Claudia's addition to intersectionality and to her activism and community organizing, it's allowed the Western world to gain a broader understanding of intersectionality down the line, right? And so while much of the work of Kimberly Crenshaw is essential to our knowledge and understanding of intersectionality today, it is imperative that we recognize the actual work of agitation and advocacy of putting your body on the line, no matter your circumstances or vulnerabilities, and just how Claudia Jones spearheaded that in the Communist Party. Claudia Jones also spoke to bourgeoisie feminism and criticized and spoke to this critique of feminism often. She advocated for women's rights, specifically through a lens that included race and class issues, right? When she had been deported by the state, she had come to call home. She continued her legacy of working class organizing in Britain. And after moving to Britain, like I mentioned, she engaged in political organizing among Caribbean immigrants and founded community initiatives like the West Indian Gazette. But culturally, Jones also initiated the first London Caribbean Carnival in 1958, influencing future cultural events such as the Notting Hill Carnival as well. In her final years, she continued her activism until her death on Christmas Eve, 1964, at age 49, and left an incredible lasting impact on political thought regarding Black women's oppression.
Yes. So I'm just going to go over some of the main critiques of both intersectionality and Marxism. Lubaba gave a really good framework for understanding some of these talks. There's a vast dialogue about this, and it's online, and a lot of these thoughts have come from the book that Lubaba mentioned, Marxism and Intersectionality. But there is a vast dialogue, vast discourse online that I encourage people to check out, and this is only a very short summary of it. So yes, as we can see, Claudia Jones and other Black communist women have had a huge influence on ideas and theories of what we call intersectionality today. However, just as Claudia has been erased from this history, because I'm sure lots of people probably didn't even hear about her until recently, or maybe even this conference. So just as she's been erased from the history, so too have the Marxist origins of these theories. So as Lubaba said, historically, both Marxism and early intersectional thought began in the mid-19th century, with Marx and Engels linking capitalism to various forms of oppression, including racism and sexism. And as such, Claudia Jones developed her theory of superexploitation through this Marxist lens. Modern intersectionality, on the other hand, has since been removed from its radical roots. While Crenshaw is credited in coining the term intersectionality, she makes notes of others who have theorized these concepts before her. The Marxist origins have been erased. Oh, that's all cut off. Well, they've been erased. They've been erased, and we need to link back to Claudia Jones and other women like her who were, so that we can understand the specificities of how oppression is experienced and interconnected. So two of the major critiques of socialists, however, are that we, I guess, are economically reductionist and Eurocentric. So this has been a really long-standing critique of Marxism and socialists broadly. But as we can see from Claudia Jones and her comrades, there has been historical engagement in these issues of gender and racial oppression within our movements. However, McCarthyism in the 40s and 50s created a lot of defensive and reactionary politics among communists. It's caused a lot of infighting and turmoil between different factions of communists in the United States, and it also allowed for conservatism and unchecked oppressive beliefs to really penetrate into trade unions. The attacks on communists and radicals by the United States government weakened the trade union movement, which allowed trade union bureaucracy, who often held more conservative politics, to kick out radical voices, most of which were often black women, as black women had always been militant voices in trade unions and in communist parties. And this is something that Claudia Jones talks about in her writing a lot. So the focus, unfortunately, became solely on class, which led to a lot of fracturing of communist organizations. So unfortunately today, some of these histories do still linger, and chauvinistic, class reductionist socialism does not support the most marginalized of our working class. Claudia Jones has shown us that speaking about race and gender oppression is essential to socialist organizing, and many theorists argue for a dialectical relationship between economic exploitation and oppression, rather than viewing them as separate. And that is something that comes from that book, The Marxism and Intersectionality. So while class is the basis that brings working people together, we have to understand that oppression is experienced differently across identities, and that some people experience double, triple, or even quadruple oppressions on top of being part of the working class. So ignoring this reality is not a Marxist-Leninist stance to take, and it only will continue to divide us as it has in the past. So I'm going to quote Claudia Jones. She's talking about the Communist Party. Our party was the first to demonstrate to white women and to the working class that the triply oppressed status of black women is the barometer for the status of all women, and that the fight for full economic, political, and social equality of the black woman is in the vital self-interest of white workers and in the vital interest of the fight to realize equality for women. To the extent further that the cause of the black woman worker is promoted, she will be able to take her rightful place in the black proletarian leadership of the national liberation movement, and by her active participation, contribute to the entire American working class, whose historic mission is to achieve a socialist America, the final and full guarantee of women's emancipation. So, moving on the other hand, some common critiques of intersectionality theory is that it utilizes an underdeveloped analysis of class. So some Marxist feminists have suggested that due to the lack of wholesome engagement with gender and racial oppression by some fundamentalist Marxists, intersectionality theorists have overcorrected their theories to leave out class almost entirely. As such, Marxists have challenged this reduction of class to just another form of oppression as missing the root of how power operates in a class society. So in speaking about how the academy has watered down radical theories, Marxist critic Dalila Agriar argues that there was a pronounced change in the works that emerged expounding the themes of gender, race, and class. The view that a meaningful exposition of their interaction demands an understanding of capitalist operations was soon to be swept away by the collapse of social movements and the onset of conservatism. By the mid to late 1980s, oh no, it's cut off again. Sorry, it's all good. And it sucks because that's a quote. But anyway, essentially boils down to the fact that it became, so essentially they're saying that the class didn't become about structure of what class is, but it became about income and your occupation instead of like the structure of class. And it became embedded in not like these ideas of oppression became embedded not in capitalism, but in matrices of domination. So yeah, just class, the idea of what class was changed to not talk about the structure of the system. No, it's all good. Thank you, though. So as such, I'm also going to quote from Martha Jimenez, who says that To argue then that class is fundamental is not to reduce gender or racial oppression to class, but to acknowledge that the underlying basic and nameless power at the root of what happens in social interactions grounded in intersectionality is class power. And Lubaba talked about that a bit earlier. So, unfortunately, due to its failure to holistically engage with critiques of capitalism and the specificities of structural class relations, it has been watered down and co-opted to serve neoliberal interests. So I'm going to give you an example. So in current day, we can look at someone like Kamala Harris, and who uses neoliberal identity politics. No, it goes somewhere, guys. They use neoliberal identity politics for their own self-interest. So the example is, I'm sure many of us have seen the video of Kamala Harris at one of her rallies, and there's anti-genocide protesters chanting, and instead of maybe even engaging with them or whatever have you, she says, "I'm speaking," and she silences the chanters, people who are protesting against a genocide, and it's atrocious because what she's saying, she's telling these people to shut up, and somehow this was seen on social media and some like mainstream media as like a girl boss move, real like reflection of bourgeoisie feminism, and she uses the discourse of feminism and the language of feminism to assert her power, reasserting her power as potentially one of the leaders of the imperialist power committing a genocide. So while Kamala Harris has obviously experienced sexism and racism in her life, she belongs to the class that has power to be able to oppress others on a broad scale. Harris has infinitely more power than any working class person and uses that power to support a genocide. So neoliberal intersectional theory, no, I'm skipping that, hold on. So, sorry, just moving on. So I want to talk about Claudia Jones as being, in relation to this, she was a staunch anti-imperialist and an anti-war advocate. She wrote several articles on the subject, including a well-articulated piece, and I love the title. It's from 1951, entitled "You Can't Have Guns and Butter Too." And she addressed that the working class in the USA could not have their basic needs met, such as food, health, education, and other day-to-day survival needs when the government is focused on war spending, and that's where your taxpayer money was going. And it's unfortunate that 70 years later, this is still true. Jones knew that capital was the driving force behind the plunder of the Caribbean and South America. Many of the trade union movements at the time were not making this connection, and Claudia pushed her comrades to take these issues seriously and emphasized that their liberation was tied up in the liberation of their comrades outside of the imperial core. Further, Claudia would speak to how the Marxist theory of the reservoir of cheap labor was driving force behind waves of Caribbean migration. And can we go down? What was I saying? Sorry, guys. Go down more. No, go up. Thank you. So reservoir cheap labor was the driving force behind waves of Caribbean migration, especially for domestic workers, migrant farm workers, and other cheap labor in the cities. She addressed that this was the continuing relationship of exploitation between the imperialist West and the global South, plundering the South for resources and capitalist expansion, and displacing the working class of those countries to work for cheap labor when needed by the same Western powers, making their home countries unlivable. So, ultimately, there are lessons we can take from intersectional theory, and we should look to its radical roots in theorists like Claudia Jones and others like her that really rooted their analysis in class and in Marxist-Leninist tradition. Many radical Black communist women have been erased from our history to minimize and to depoliticize much of their politics. It's important to understand that as socialists, we really need to prioritize the experiences and the realities of people who are the most marginalized under the capitalist system. Claudia Jones said that the working class as a whole will not be liberated until Black women are liberated. And as the saying goes, none of us are free until we're all free. Intersectionality theory gives us a framework to be able to talk more about these experiences, but we also need to root our theories and understandings in a class analysis in order to not fall prey to neoliberal identity politics that ignore our material realities under a capitalist system.
Thanks so much. So to wrap it up a little bit, Claudia Jones is credited with a lot of this work. Kimberly Crenshaw is credited with a lot of this work. And as we've talked about, it's important that we do recognize that there are likely many, many, many other names of those behind the scenes that were supporting Jones, who may have been part of her close circle or her close network of comrades who supported her and will not be credited for this work, right? And I think that really is an important lesson to understand from this work, that it does take all of us, that all of us are essential, that all of us are leaders, that it is inherently about each individual person being able to tap into the collective and say, this is my responsibility too, this is my struggle too, this is my fight too. And for Jones to be recognized in history, how many operated day in and day out behind the scenes to really make this advocacy happen, to make this work happen, to make these movements what they are today, right? I think of the history of Black Bolsheviks and how many others, again, are not credited, but also how many remained enslaved and still contributed to the working class revolutions and the working class movement that we have today, right? How many still helped bolster and drive that engine forward in our continued fight for liberation? Jones's contributions to intersectionality remind us of this, that racial justice is integral and imperative in any fight for liberation, that racial justice sows the seeds of transformative justice, and that it addresses the root of a cause. Without racial justice, we cannot truly achieve liberation, and we cannot fight racism, we cannot fight sexism, we cannot fight any of these issues without also fighting capitalism and working hand in hand in order to make those things happen. And so it's important that we all, again, recognize the shared labor of our fight and the shared labor that and that advocacy that we need to do for each other to say your fight is my fight and that I'm in this with you. Thank you.